Hi everyone. My name is Lukas Borkowski. I'm the Director of European Partnerships with Viamo. It's a pleasure meeting you all for the session on partnering for scale or scaling for impact, or however you want to call it. Viamo is standing for Via Mobile. We're a global social business specializing in mobile engagement and meaningful conversations with people in primarily Africa, Asia, and Latin America, with about 25 million unique users last year, mostly in hard-to-reach places. And I have the pleasure to be convening a session today with a dear partner of ours to speak about how we partner together for achieving scale and impact at scale. To just get us started into that session, a few years ago, the world agreed on these SDGs for 2030, and it becomes apparent that there is a clear challenge and a clear problem, which is information isolation. Not a lot of people have access to information to make informed decisions and to make better decisions on their own and when they want and when they need it. So on the other hand, we all know that the penetration of technology, and namely mobile phones, has accelerated rapidly, exponentially over the past few years, but it also outpaces by far how these technologies and mobile phones in particular are being used by organizations around the world for achieving these SDGs. We see pilots here and there, we see SMS campaigns, apps, chatbots being rolled out all over the place, and not only last year, but even before then. But we do not often see digital being integrated thoroughly and strategically and systematically into programs, into projects, into programming, and being considered not just as a cherry on the cake or as a small technology pilot to show off or test something new, but as a transversal activity. So that is what we want to speak about today, about how can we use technology in a meaningful, appropriate way to give people access to information in a way. And we at Viamo have worked on digital strategies with key partners, and I'm really honored to have two of them with us today, who will give us insights into how they have been working with digital strategies and why they think it is important and what comes out of that. And also a dear colleague from Viamo who will present how we do digital strategies and what to watch out for. Just before we hear from the first of them, I'd like to really invite you to ask your questions during the session in the questions section of this MS Teams chat functionality, and to share your questions. We will have also a networking session in about an hour from, in about 2 hours from now. I guess it is at a good opportunity for emerging into deeper conversations, whereas we would like to keep the panel discussion in the second part of our session really for asking our panelists about their experiences. So to get started, I'd like to, first of all, present our panelists and the three people that I just mentioned. We have Laura Sheridan, Program Manager with the UNDP Youth Engagement Program in Pakistan. We then have Regine Theodat, the Viamo Country Director for Haiti, and Michael Brossmann, the Head of Component for GIZ PrAda in Madagascar. And with that, I'd like to pass it on. We go through their input sessions, about 10 minutes each, and then have plenty of time for questions and discussion towards the second part of this session. Thanks for that. And Laura, if I may ask you to start.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lukas, and thanks to the organizers for having me on the panel today, and thanks to all the participants for joining. As Lukas mentioned, as many development organizations move to design, implement, and institutionalize digital strategies, this is a really timely conversation, and I'm happy to share the experience we've had so far with the Youth Empowerment Team at UNDP Pakistan in terms of setting up and implementing our digital strategy for the program, as well as some of the partnerships that we've developed along the way. It's been quite a journey since we started back in 2017 to reorient our programme to be fit for purpose, and digitalisation has indeed played a major part in that transformation, which is still ongoing. If we move to the next slide, please. So if we start from the beginning, I took over the youth empowerment portfolio back in 2017, having worked on area-specific conflict and recovery programming for the past few years, and my remit from senior management was to transform some of our smaller ongoing youth projects scattered across the country into a national youth programme, which would have national policy impact. While that process presented many challenges, as you can imagine, for me the biggest challenge was indeed the size of the target population. With a total population of 220 million, 68% of this population being under 30, and around half of those being in the youth bracket, it was clear that our traditional approach to having smaller grassroots interventions and small trainings for 200 youth weren't going to be sufficient to reach the masses and have the intended impact. Luckily, UNDP had recently completed the research on its National Human Development Report on unleashing the potential for youth, following an extensive consultation process, which involved the participation of over 100,000 youth from across the country, and that provided us with a really clear policy roadmap for youth empowerment in Pakistan along the 3 E's of engagement, education, and economic empowerment. So based on the recommendations of the report, we set up with the team to build a portfolio of interventions in each of these domains, which would take our programming to the next level. Next slide, please. So once we knew what to do, then came the real question. How do we take this program to scale? At that point, and with limited resources, going digital really seemed like the only option to reach as many youth as possible. Back in 2017, as you can see with the figures on the screen, we already knew that mobile and internet penetration were relatively high in the country, especially among the youth, and we believed that we could enhance our outreach by fully engaging in social media content and using digital means to reach out to our target participants. Given that mobility for young women in some areas of the country is a particular constraint for their participation in on-ground trainings and engagement sessions, we also thought that digital outreach might enhance our engagement with young females who could participate in the programme from their homes. At the same time, it was noted that not everyone that has a phone has a smartphone. While internet usage was and continues to be on the increase in Pakistan, it's still low in comparison with overall mobile penetration. Also, internet users are not necessarily smartphone users. Smartphone penetration in Pakistan is still around 25%. So digital audio was still going to be very relevant. As you can see, the numbers for digital access have continued to grow quite rapidly, even in the last year, which is really promising. Although it definitely doesn't remove the need to continue to work with traditional partners on ground to engage face-to-face with youth, especially in rural areas. If we move to the next slide, please. Another important element that fed into the development of our strategy was what we call the innovation explosion at UNDP. In April 2017, a new administrator had taken over and had promised to lead UNDP Pakistan to play an important role in the future of development. Business as usual and the way we approach development had to change. And as Lukas suggested, reports are already showing that the Sustainable Development Goals were unlikely to be met by 2030 without rapid, ubiquitous innovation. It followed that new and innovative approaches had to be introduced and tested that effectively embrace the complexity of development challenges and allow opportunities to create transformative changes. What felt like all of a sudden, we started to get encouragement from global, regional, and local leadership to innovate. The buzzwords that you see here on the screen, experimentation, systems thinking, co-creation, were everywhere. While innovation is not only about digitalization, the innovation agenda itself definitely helps to encourage digitalization in the right circumstances. And so with all of these wonderful concepts in our heads and UNDP's rather strict operations and programming guidelines in our hand, that is another story that we will save for later, we sat down with some like-minded colleagues to think up our first few digital experiments. Immediately, if we move on to the next slide, please, we were faced with our first hurdle, being development practitioners from governance, economic and crisis areas. No one in our team had actually ever developed a digital strategy before, and corporate guidance was still being developed based on on-ground experiences. And so with the help of our new innovation team, we began to look for allies outside of our organisation. Luckily, Pakistan is a hub of techie, social enterprises and IT firms. So before long, we were meeting with cool young men and particularly young women who were giving us all kinds of crazy ideas on how we could interact digitally with youth in a sustainable and effective manner. I still remember the day that we met with colleagues from Viamo, Pakistan for the first time and explained very innocently all the ways we wanted to engage with youth via surveys, monitoring, digital campaigns. And we were pretty amazed when the team was like, oh yeah, we can do that. And then effectively drew what became the backbone of our digital engagement strategy on a flip chart. Following a competitive procurement process, we were lucky enough to engage Viamo in a long-term agreement, which meant basically we could engage them on an assignment basis as needed, which became an important launching pad for many of our office's digital interventions. Also, around the same time, UNDP took the decision to set up an amazing network of innovation labs, and Pakistan was lucky to secure one. In 2019, UNDP Pakistan set up shop and started supporting projects in a more systematic way to explore new partnerships, to run experiments, and to work on sense making and solutions mapping to make our programmatic offer fit for purpose. Our young team was happy to learn, and we joined almost every pilot set up by the ACT Lab. This enthusiasm was also shared by other projects in the office and UN agencies who joined forces to roll out their own innovation and digital strategies too, in collaboration with the private sector, local innovators, and local government. Even in the hardest to reach areas, such as the tribal districts along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, we were able to use digital engagement to hear from citizens and influence public policy accordingly. With Viamo as our lead partner on digitalization and our Innovation ACT Lab colleagues as our partners in crime and mentors, with the financial and technical backing from many pragmatic development partners, such as Japan, Norway, UK, Australia, USAID, and the government of Pakistan itself, the youth programme has since engaged with over 50 partners from UN agencies, government, social enterprises, civil society, academia, youth organisations, the wider private sector, to conduct work under our youth empowerment portfolio to directly reach over 80,000 youth across the country and with around 1 million engagements via digital content. Our experience with digital engagement was indeed a lifesaver during the COVID pandemic, when we had to reprogram almost every one of our 40 contracts to deliver services online, a process which went remarkably smoothly thanks to our excellent partner base. We also managed to do some great work with UN agencies on digital youth engagement in the COVID response, which is now leading the way for more deeper, longer-term partnerships between the UN agencies working on youth in Pakistan. Next slide, please. Our digital strategy has continued to evolve over the years as we learn more and as we receive more and more support from our global and regional offices. In 2019, UNDP launched its global digital strategy, which provided further clarity on service lines to support our clients in the digital arena, and also made considerable efforts to enhance our own institutional capacity to manage digital transformation. Especially on the latter, there has been impressive progress in relatively less time, and we now count on a host of in-house digital, technology, and innovation experts who are helping us to further our digital portfolio. Next slide, please. With a view to learn from our collective experience on digitalization, UNDP's Evaluation Office has also recently conducted an evaluation of our digitalization support to date, especially those carried out in response. If we just go to the next slide, please, Lukas. Particularly important to know is the human aspects of digitalization and the fact that technology alone will not be enough to implement a digital strategy. Elements such as behaviour change are equally as important. Also, the digital divide continues to be very real, and digital outreach must continue to accompany traditional means of community engagement, especially if we wish to leave no one behind. Before I end, I'll just give you a flavour of some of our achievements in the digital sphere under the youth programme with our partners. If we can just move along to 2 slides, please. On to the one with results, please, Lukas. I'm not seeing the slides update, but I'll just go ahead and...
Okay, I'll update it on the fly. Sorry for that.
No, yep, that's us. Perfect. Thanks. So just before I end, I'm giving you a flavour of some of our achievements in the digital sphere under our programme. So far we've carried out 10 digital surveys with partners to better understand the job aspirations of youth, to understand the impact of COVID on young entrepreneurs, and most recently to understand youth perceptions on climate change, which we did in partnership with the Ministry of Climate Change. We generally use these findings to better inform programming and resource mobilisation going forward. We also have used a combination of social media, digital audio and SMS to reach out to youth to engage them in a number of digital campaigns for COVID awareness. We did a particularly interesting outreach campaign where we engaged with religious clerics to promote their support for government-led COVID SOPs. We've also carried out key messaging on hypermasculinity during the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, and we're about to launch another SMS campaign on preventing violent extremism with the National Counter-Terrorism Authority. As digital skills are a key part of the future of work, we also train youth online on skills such as big data, Amazon Web Services and freelancing. Across the board, we seek to work closely with the relevant government body to show them that in the right circumstances and with the right strategy, digital engagement can provide a cost-effective way to reach scale. We are currently using this approach to roll out a pilot Youth Development Index survey with the Prime Minister's Youth Programme, the Planning Commission, the Commonwealth and several other UN agencies. We move to the next slide, please. The medium that we choose for each intervention is decided on a case-by-case basis and in close consultation with our digital partners, depending on the type of content, the development objective, the expected coverage, and the digital literacy of target population. While we were initially quite fond of app application, it's definitely not a decision to be taken lightly, and as we found ourselves, other forms of sharing information might be more appropriate. We have also brought in a behavioural insights expert who works closely with our digital team to ensure a comprehensive approach to messaging, which has proved to be quite useful. We move on to the next slide. Viamo was kind enough to share some of the factors that we use to decide which digital tools to use for each intervention. So where the population uses smartphones and uses high data, we tend to use online campaigns. Whereas for those who are less digitally literate and mostly use the call function on their simple phones, IVR has been a really good means of passing on complex information. And in other cases, we use SMS. In addition to these factors, as a program manager, we have to be practical. So in most cases, we also consider the cost that we have for each intervention, and we try and manage the most appropriate and effective strategy we have within that budget. I can honestly say that in each and every one of our digital activities that I mentioned earlier, we have really learned something. I mean, it's not all been perfect. Some campaigns haven't had the intended impact. Others haven't been sustainable. But being able to have concrete data on what worked and what didn't has been indispensable for improving our approach and especially for planning the next iteration. We just move to the next slide. So based on this experience and with a view to expand the digital strategy within UNDP, me and my team have now played an active part in a cross-portfolio digital transformation team working within the UNDP country office to build our first digital country office strategy with support from our headquarters. We recently had a very interesting mission where we were able to meet with the President and the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and who are really thankful that we are taking an integrated approach to digital transformation moving forward. And we're now taking that journey forward with the colleagues in our country office and our government partners, and look forward to see where that journey takes us. I'll leave it here for the moment, but thanks so much for giving us a chance to share our experience, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have in the Q&A session. Back over to you now, Lukas. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you so much, Laura, and really inspiring. And again, an invitation to everyone who's attending this session to leave your questions in the chat room here in MS Teams. We will make sure to cover them in the second part of our session, where we will have a panel discussion and you have a chance to ask Laura questions about her presentation and their achievements in Pakistan. Thank you. I'd like to now look at the how of digital strategy development and how that is actually being implemented. So I have the pleasure to ask my colleague Regine from Viamo, Haiti, to walk us through how she has been implementing a digital strategy recently. Regine, over to you.
Thank you, Lukas. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So as Lukas explained, my name is Regine Theodat. I'm the country director for Haiti, and I'm really going to talk today about how it all gets done. I think Laura laid a really nice foundation for the kind of information I'm going to share about how you go through this process of iterating and figuring out and adjusting based off of what your end user needs. And so I'm going to go through our methodology. I'm going to give it some context by explaining a digital strategy that will be implemented in Haiti for a reforestation project. Next slide. And so what I like about the methodology for doing a digital strategy is that it's quite intuitive. I think if you sat down and asked yourself, what do I need to be able to create a digital strategy for a specific service population, you would probably come at this conclusion. And so it has 4 main steps. It has the desk research, which is really like the low-hanging fruit. What are you able to easily get access to, either from your partner or from yourself, from the internet, whatever it is that you can do to cast a really wide net to be able to really get information that you would need to be able to create a digital strategy. And then you kind of come back a little bit and you do more field research, and that is more of the tailored research that you do based off of what your desk research provides to you. And then you do a solution design, and then of course you deliver your final findings. Next slide. Thank you. And so in addition to our methodology, we have this approach. I'm sure many of you have heard it before. It's called human-centered design. And it's something that we actually use across the board in Viamo, whether or not it's developing content, whether or not it's developing new products. It really is this approach that we use. And of course, we use it in our digital strategies. And so this process is, as the title states, it's human-centered. So you take your end user and you put them in the middle and you design around them completely with them in mind. What is it that they need? What is it that they're trying to achieve? What are their limitations? What are the kinds of technology that they use? Whatever it is, you put your user at the center, and everything you develop should be able to impact them in a meaningful way and consider their actual needs. And so this human-centered design approach is in 3 steps. It starts off as discovery, it moves into prototyping and testing, and then third, it ends in launch. What's quite interesting and relevant about this approach is that I like to think of it as cyclical. So you go from discovery and you go to prototype and test, but you can go back to discovery, and then you go back to prototype and test and end at launch, and you can even go back again in the full circle. And you do this process back and forth. And I think Laura's example is really on point with this, is that throughout the entire process, you're really going through to discover what your end user needs, to test this idea and then see if it works, and then also try to adjust the method that you're using to interact with them. And so to give you some context about the digital strategy that we just implemented this past fall in Haiti, we worked with a partner in the northern corridor of Haiti, which is quite rural, but vastly rich in natural resources and used to heavily be quite agricultural. And they did a reforestation project, obviously to impact things like watershed, climate erosion, appropriate tree covering, etc. And so they have a goal of planting X amount of trees. And it's a mature project, so they're over halfway through the end of their term, the end of the project. And the goal is to make sure that when they leave, the service population isn't like, okay, great, we got all these trees, we planted everything, and they're gone, so we're gonna cut them down. And so people tend to cut down trees here, and I'm sure in many other countries, for charcoal. So either to sell the trees to create charcoal, or to use the trees for their own charcoal fuel needs to cook food. And so the purpose of this digital strategy was to first figure out a way for people to not cut down the trees after the project is over. And secondly, to sort of see what is an appropriate way to give value to the trees so that people don't want to cut them down. And so we did this 3-step process couched within our methodology, where we did the discovery phase where we explored existing platforms and we understood needs. And then we tested some hypotheses that we created in the discovery phase. And then we sort of did this cyclical piece of the cyclical process. Next slide. And so the discovery phase is actually my favorite phase. It's really about finding out what your end user is all about by looking at it from multiple different angles. And you look at this slide, and it really is 6 different steps that we did in this particular instance for the discovery phase. It's about looking at first your existing global experiences. And for us at Viamo, it was quite easy because we've had similar projects in other countries where we've wanted to allow people to not be able to cut down trees or to have other value-added mechanisms for creating wealth that would keep them from cutting down trees. And so one of the hypotheses that we developed is that people wouldn't feel the need to cut down trees to make money if they were making money doing something else. And then of course, when the trees get to be 5 or 6 years old and they're mature enough, they would produce fruit. And that fruit-bearing tree would be so that they wouldn't want to cut down this tree because this fruit was a way to make money. And then we also looked at outside of Viamo, what did our partner have that they had implemented in other countries? What have other companies implemented? And it really is about casting that wide net to see what is out there that you could use to inform a creation of some kind of prototype or a creation of a hypothesis that you could then test. And then what discovery in this instance brought us to is what are the local experiences? What have people implemented in Haiti that has worked to be able to do this? And this is where things get quite interesting because there are so many different ways that people do creative mechanisms to make money using digital strategies. Do they use SMS? Do they use WhatsApp groups? Do they use Facebook groups? What are the different ways that people are using to create different ways that they could make money that would then make them not want to go into the process of deforestation? And then we moved into a stakeholder analysis, and this is all about looking at the different kind of stakeholders that are involved. It could be, for us in this instance, it was about the monitoring, evaluation, and learning team of our partner. It was also about tackling the different implementers. Who were the people that actually implemented this project for our partner? Who are the ones that actually distributed the plants? How did they feel about this process? What did they discover when they were working with the end user? What were their thoughts? And it was all about just really, without as much bias as possible, going into a situation and analyzing what is going on. What do the agronomists on the ground think? What do the end users think? And then, of course, after this, we moved into the mobile landscape because as Viamo, we do look closely at mobile landscape. But of course, this is a digital strategy, so it's any kind of digital strategy that you could think of. It doesn't have to only be mobile. So we also looked at what other communication tools do people use? What are their preferences? What is their literacy level? What is their facility with smartphones? What is their facility with regular phones, tablets, emails? What do they use on a regular basis to impact or facilitate information sharing in their lives? And then all of these 5 pieces go into what we do to do a persona development. And that essentially is a profile of our end user and the various stakeholders. And so that allows us to take all this information, develop personas, the people that are most impacted by the decisions that we're going to make, so that we can always think of them as we go through this digital strategy, as we develop this digital strategy, so we can think of the various people that are being impacted along the chain of events that we're creating. Next slide. And so this is the prototype and test. This is step 2. And remember, I said it's quite cyclical. So you could find that you get halfway through discovery and you go into prototype and test, then you go back into discovery. And prototype and test is probably almost as equally as my favorite for the discovery phase, because at this phase, this is when you're really able to be across from the end user. And so we went in with the hypothesis from our discovery phase that, okay, so we want the users to not cut down trees. And we also want them, and we thought that one easy way to do this would be to just create another way for them to create means. And so if they have means from their other crops, because this area is quite agricultural, quite a lot of farmlands, then they would not feel the need to use the charcoal, or they would be able to find other alternatives or afford propane or something else that would keep them from cutting down these trees. But what we found was, speaking with the service population, was another wealth of information, another way of looking at this particular digital strategy. So these pictures are from a group that we met with when we went up to the north, and we spent 3 days doing interviews on the field with various end users. And so in this case, the actual recipients of the trees and the actual beneficiaries, where the use would be the potential users of whatever digital strategy that we presented. And what was quite interesting is that they had grown up learning about the importance of trees. They had grown up having these traditions about when you cut trees, when you don't cut trees, how do you maintain soil erosion, how do you prevent watershed. So in this, on the picture on the right, this is a hill that they're trying to sort of create a barrier by planting trees in specific areas. And they had traditionally done this, but over the years when things have gotten difficult, they've stopped doing it, or they maybe never fully understood the science behind it, but it was traditionally they grew up hearing about why this was important. And so the agronomist that worked for our partner was able to give them the science behind it, and they married it with their traditional understanding of what they grew up learning. And so because of that, they had an appreciation for why it was important to not cut down these trees, why it was important to continue to plant these trees, and why it was important to also maintain this for the environment. And so we had a second layer from this prototyping and testing and digging down deeper into our field research that we didn't have before. So before we had this idea of we create wealth for them in other ways, they won't want to go after the trees. But this also created this second layer of if they understand, or if they are able to relearn or re-understand or remember the reasons why they did these things in the past, this creates value for them to maintain the trees. And we learned a lot from them about how for decades they had massive amounts of oranges, but they've lost them. We learned about bird pests that would come and eat their crops because they didn't have trees to eat off from before. And so it was that added depth that took us back to, of course, the discovery phase and let us prototype and test some other potential plausibilities for how we could create a digital strategy for them. And so this field research really led us to understand that they had the hopes of the lucrative crops that they would have from planting at a fair market price to be able to sell it in a way that made monetary sense for them. But we also learned that they hoped to be able to have this thriving environmental ecosystem that they had before. And it seemed like the deterrent for all of this was information linkages, understanding climatic change, and it's just essentially the information that was missing for them to be able to realize their hopes. Next slide. And so the final stage is the launch. I think in many digital strategies, you do focus mostly on step 1 and step 2. And in some digital strategies, you get to do the launch phase, like a mini pilot, and go back to step 1. For this particular one, we created an end strategy that we suggested, but we haven't reached the launch phase. And so after doing all of this, we understood that we needed to do a mini pilot that would do some sort of automated weather updates that would allow the end users to know when to plant, how to plant, and that would create wealth for them because they would have a more efficient way of planting their crops and managing their farms. And secondarily, we learned about the climate-related planting info that we could do through gamified content, but also really being able to share the scientific information that they could marry with what they learned growing up to teach them, again, how to recreate that thriving ecosystem that they had had for many decades. And then finally, the market linkages idea, where you are able, after they're able to grow their crops, they're able to find a buyer that would buy them at a fair market price, which would allow them to also create wealth so that the trees wouldn't be, the charcoal for the trees wouldn't be the automatic, let me go to that as a way of creating some means for my family. And so all of these, we thought of putting them into a toll-free line that they could use a dummy phone with, because we had learned that this end user had a very low access to data and a very low facility with any kind of smartphone, but really were able to use phones quite well and relied on them very much for their daily day-to-day activities. Next slide. Yep, that's it for me. And I guess I'll pass it over to you again, Lukas.
Great, thank you, Regine. Thanks a lot, and excellent to learn from your experience in Haiti. And there's so many different facets of going through these steps and taking those decisions and working through these. Thanks a lot. Again, if you have questions for Regine or Laura, feel free to put them in the chat so that we can keep the discussion going right after the next and last input. And for that, I'm happy to call you up, Michael, to walk us through what you've achieved based on a digital strategy that you implemented for your program in Madagascar.
Yes, thanks a lot, Lukas. And first of all, also congratulations to my two previous colleagues for the excellent presentations and also for the achievements you have done in the respective countries. It's really interesting to see those different examples also for me, from who has more experience in a very specific country, namely Madagascar, which is obviously not comparable in terms of its IT infrastructure and usages to Pakistan. But definitely there are also some similarities and some experience that you've shared, Laura, where I could very much relate to, which I found really interesting, as well as your aspects of analyzing the process of developing a digital strategy, Regine, which I think we back in 2017 have been one of the, say, prototypes of first victims of Viamo, where we had the partnership of developing such a digital strategy. So thanks a lot for those inputs already. So Lukas, when you invited me to come to this session, you asked me to present on some of the key outcomes of our digital strategy and our project in Madagascar and do that in 10 minutes. And I thought, okay, well, thanks for that. That's going to be a big challenge at the beginning of the year. So what I did is I prepared a few slides, just very short information on the project background for our audience to understand what I'm talking about afterwards in terms of the outcomes. And then not do a complete reporting on all the outcomes that we have achieved so far, but rather from an analytical point of view, point towards let's say three axes of potential outcomes that you might want to expect from a digital strategy and see how that played out for us in our case, in our project in Madagascar. So if we go to the next slide, this is just some background information on the project where I'm a head of component. So we are a project working on climate change adaptation in the agriculture sector in Madagascar, in the rural areas particularly. Our overall objective is to bring together the public sector, research institutions, and private actors in order to foster, on the one hand, economically viable, and on the other hand, climate resilient value chains. We intend to do this by means of the combination of three components. The first one being climate services for agriculture, the second one being development and adaptation of agricultural value chains, so very let's say hands-on activities on the ground in different value chains, and the third one being climate risk insurance. So if we now go back to the year 2017, the beginning of our project, we were a completely new project from scratch, so there was no predecessor. And we had a very clear structure and indicators as to our project documents, but there were a lot of different ways of getting there potentially. So there was not a very strict sense of, okay, you need to employ this approach or that approach. And that left us at the same time with a lot of possibilities, but at the same time also with maybe some confusion as to how we want to go about this. And at the same time, in the background, there was always some kind of what I call here on the slide a bit of noise on the digital approaches. So a lot of communication from our headquarters on fostering digital approaches, newsletters internationally, good examples, overall push also to implement more digital approaches and employ them in your programming. But for us, it was not quite clear on how actually to go about this and how to put this into our project in a systematic way. So what we did is, and that's on the next slide, we decided to partner up with Viamo and have a more strategic look at this and develop first a digital strategy before even touching or piloting or doing any of the technology related work of implementation afterwards. And we posed ourselves two big questions. The first big question being, how can digital approaches foster achieving our objectives and indicators? Because that's what we're accountable for. That's our main goals of our projects. We need to deliver on these objectives and indicators. And that's also for us, it was quite important not to do digital because of going digital, but rather to having a strategic look at where do digital approaches foster really or give new avenues for achieving these objectives and indicators. And then as a second level question, we asked ourselves, and now having that in mind, what are appropriate technologies and solutions in the Malagasy context and specifically in the project context, which is mainly rural populations in the south and southeast of the country, where we have very remote communities, and the physical access is not really an option on a day-to-day basis, particularly in the rainy season. So this is our overall, let's say, our overall thinking in the beginning as to how to tackle these digital strategy. We then ask ourselves, okay, what do we want to achieve with it? What are our expectations? And what I would like to do is to compare now our expectations regarding 3 different types of expectations with the outcomes we achieved now going 3 years into the future, into 2020, 2021 again, and having a look in retrospective. So did we actually deliver on these expectations and the digital strategy in particular? So the first expectation we had was that a sound digital strategy provides orientation and focus. Now, on the next slide, did it deliver on that? That, from my side, I can say that it is a clear yes. So we spent a lot of time using the approach that Regine just shared from a methodological point of view in order to focus or to define our focus, which was mostly on the niche of providing rural communities with relevant information on different topics. Mainly, but not only, relying on an IVR-based service, so the 321 hotline that we have heard about just a minute ago, which has the advantage of at an access at the time and the place of need of the target population, and there's the possibility of a two-way communication. So we use it not only for disseminating information, but also for feedback loops and also for surveys. This was our main approach for, let's say, for the rural population without an access to smartphones, without mobile data, with mainly 2G or 3G simple mobile phone devices, etc. However, we had a variety of target groups also on our project, and also through this digital strategy, we were able to actually identify 2 other approaches, so complementary approaches that we wanted to pursue, which were much more specific and specialized, particularly the second one, where we are focusing on modernizing the data flow and storage of the National Meteorological Service. So talking about climate services, this is a very specific activity, which is highly specialized in terms of its compatibility with the WMO standards, the experiences from other Met services in Africa, but something which now 3 years into the future, I perceive as one of the most, if we are able to say that, transformative activities that we have done so far. And then thirdly, as a third, let's say, axe that we identified, that's the development of a mobile application and website for the National Meteorological Service. And there I would just would like to echo what Laura had said in the beginning. It took us almost 2 years to actually come to the point of decision. Yes, we do want to develop this application together with the National Met Agency, because there are many questions to ask oneself before you actually start developing a new mobile application. This was for us a fully fledged design process from scratch with a lot of twists and turns, unexpected turns sometimes, and also sometime in between, we were on the verge of abandoning this project due to different circumstances. But retrospectively, I'm very happy that we came through with it because there is a clear target group, there is a clear use case, there is a clear personas, and there is definitely the need for this mobile application, these services of the National Meteorological Agency. So this is in terms of orientation and focus. I would say, yes, definitely it helped us a lot to actually get our thoughts together and think about, okay, what do we actually want to do and where's the added value of all this? Our second expectation, and this is the next slide, please, was that if we are going to developing a digital strategy, it should definitely consider delivering at scale. Because we don't want just to pilot something, then we don't need a digital strategy for it. So looking at that, how have we delivered on that? First of all, and this was for us very important, most of the content that we developed, yes, we have our target population in our target areas. However, the access to it is not restricted to this project beneficiaries. So most of this content is accessible actually for everyone and everywhere in Madagascar through this toll-free 321 hotline. And through the data we have received so far, actually a bigger chunk of the users are actually outside our project regions. So this is something which was important for us to consider from the beginning on, because once we have chosen a technology and chosen an approach, it's very difficult to change that afterwards, and you're in a kind of a locked-in situation. So this saved us from a lot of trouble looking backwards. Then talking about scale, did we actually deliver at scale? Well, that's a difficult question to answer, but there are certain indications that at least for some of the services, yes, we did. So 2 examples here. One is a seasonal crop calendar we developed for 5 crops and for all the regions in Madagascar, co-owned with the National Meteorological Agency and the Ministry of Agriculture. It was launched in 2019. It's updated every year before the planting season, and we have already more than 1.5 million interactions with this service. And more than 60% of the users were very satisfied or satisfied. So yes, there's definitely room for improvement. However, compared to the baseline scenario, this is definitely going at scale. Then another example is a path-based audio game, also called 1G game, which we introduced, also launched on this hotline in September 2018 with more than 750,000 interactions, so also very popular. And here the interesting thing is that we actually used this game also to see where there's the interest in information about the real insurance product that we actually, together with an insurance company in Madagascar, developing. So this was also not only for us to sensitize the population, but also to get information about who could actually be interested in such a product in real life. So 2021 will, in the end, tell if we indeed delivered at scale or not. We are more or less confident so far, but the implementation of the communication strategy is ongoing. So at the end of the year, we hope to be able to actually evaluate in a more stronger and quantitative fashion, did we now deliver at scale or not? But so far with these 2 examples, I would say that we are more or less optimistic. And the last part, the last aspect I want to touch upon, is that we also expected the digital strategy to prepare for the long run. So not only having a look at our pilots and the project landscape for the next 3 years, but also looking at what actually happens afterwards. And these are also very important questions to ask oneself in the beginning, and not only halfway through the project. So having a look at that, did we achieve this or not? On the next slide, please. First of all, one important aspect is that in these analysis and this iterative process that Regine, she mentioned, we regarded both the current situation, but also the future trends, because in the current situation, there are a lot of constraints still in Madagascar, with the rural population only having access to limited extent to 2G or 3G, mostly simple telephones, etc. But on the other hand, in the past 4 years, there have been a major shift and a major so there was we have now 4 by multiplication by 4 over the last 4 years of the number of calls from our target population. So even if right now the penetration rate even of simple mobile phones is not that great in Madagascar, there's a clear tendency that this is growing and the market is there also, and there's a lot of interest of this target population. So if we actually want to do something for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, we definitely decided that this focus on IVR and simple telephones is a very interesting avenue compared to traditional non-digital approaches. At the same time, there's also a growing penetration of more and more smartphones, tablets, also using of mobile data by a certain subset of our target population. That's notably the agriculture extension workers and the agripreneurs. And that's why also with this meteorological app and some audiovisual content, we're going for a complementary target group. So it's not for the same target group, but 2 different target groups, considering the current situation and future scenarios. The second part, and I think that's the most important aspect, is that we intentionally did not create a new hotline, a new service, something which is only focused on our project, but rather something which already existed and which will exist after the project has finished. And this is a win-win situation, in this case, both for our project and for Viamo and Airtel, the hosts of this hotline, because we, with our project content, we reinforce, let's say, the well, the knowledge of this platform, also the content of this platform tells there are much more users than there were before. But at the same time, for us, we have this also this base users. There's a lot of already users subscribed to this hotline that we can touch upon, which we do not have to contact from scratch and only with our project resources. And the third part is that we are in the also in the process of developing more long-term solutions for particularly popular dynamic content. So, for example, this seasonal crop calendars that I already mentioned, there's an MOU being finalized right now between Viamo and the different public actors that are contributing to the continuous updates of these crop calendars, so that we actually, as a project, we're facilitating this process, but we will not be responsible for these updates anymore afterwards. So it's a public service together, teaming up with Viamo as a social enterprise, so in order to actually ensuring the longevity of this service. And there are additional ideas and propositions under development, which are not that far so far. So that's the focus of 2021. But we are also confident for not for all of the services, but for some of the services to actually find proper solutions. So now, looking back at all these three aspects, these key expectations and outcomes, well, is this story of a happily ever after? Is everything great and is everybody happy now with these aspects? Well, obviously not. This would be a fairy tale, and unfortunately there are no fairy tales, no silver bullets in development, and we all know that neither with digital approaches nor with non-digital approaches. However, we definitely were able to have a structured approach, to have an approach which prepared for scale, and to have an approach which considered the long run. And it prevented us from doing a lot of mistakes somewhere in between this journey. There were definitely some bumps and twists along the road. However, I'm quite confident that with this digital strategy, we were able to design better products and products that are better prepared for the future. And also something which, in maybe a question that somebody asked me, that like, would you do it again? So would you recommend it? Would you do it again? I would say we would definitely do it again. Maybe with a lot of learnings and with some things we would do differently, but something I can recommend based on our project experience, because in the end, the resources and time you spend in the beginning of the project helps you to save a lot of time and energy in the end. So thanks a lot for this, and over to you, Lukas, back to the facilitator.
Great, thank you so much, Michael, and really, really happy to read about your analysis. It was great working with you in Madagascar on that strategy. Thanks a lot. Right, so we heard about why a digital strategy is needed and how that fits into program design from Laura. We heard about how you would do a digital strategy from Regine and what the outcomes are for digital strategy. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat here. We'll go over them in just a minute. But also a quick reminder that we'd like to hear from you about your experiences, about your thoughts, about your input, and we will have a discussion on partnering for scale in a little while from now. So have a look at the agenda and please do join us so that we can engage in a broader discussion and hear about more examples and thoughts and inputs. But now to the questions. If I may ask all of you three to turn on your videos and unmute yourself. We do have great questions in the chat, and I'd like to start with one for you, Regine. In that process of developing a digital strategy, the question is, how would you achieve, or how would you plan for sustainability?
Oh, that is a great question. So our digital strategy, the entire focus really was to tackle the question of sustainability. And so our partner wanted us to make sure that what they did was actually going to live on beyond the time limit of the project. And so it was all about, trying to figure out ways to keep these trees in as long as possible. And so how we suggested that we be able to do this on the long term is to use our 3-2-1 service, which we were just in the middle of launching in Haiti. And that was a way for the information that we developed along with them to, there's a beeping going behind me. The information that we developed to be able to be housed on an information line for free for the end users to be able to access 24/7 on this line.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Laura, a question for you is, what advice would you give, our fellow development specialists when they're looking to incorporate more digital elements into their programming?
Thanks, Lukas. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really valid question. And just to say that, from the offset, and as it may have been obvious in my presentation, I'm not a digital expert. And I think a lot of my colleagues in the development field find themselves in a similar situation where we don't necessarily know everything about technology, about innovation, and we're really being forced to learn as we go to keep ourselves as professionals relevant, and then also our programming relevant for our target populations. So I think in my experience, really, number one would be to find allies within your organization. For me, that was essential. When you're trying to bring something new into your organization, if you're a lone ranger, it's always a bit more difficult. So really try and find those colleagues who have a shared passion for promoting digitalization and work together on it. Secondly, I would say really try and speak to people that you don't normally talk to. For us, really, that was essential. If we keep on talking to, our government counterparts and our similar development partners, we're really not enhancing our knowledge. But as soon as we went outside and started speaking, particularly with young social enterprises and startups, we really understood that the ecosystem outside of the development sector was much more mature, and we could really learn from them in terms of developing our processes and adapting to what the country was already doing, in effect. And I think the last point would just be to really not to be scared to fail. And I think that is something that luckily our senior management sort of drilled into us on the innovation experience, that we can really take chances, do it, try it. If it fails, it's okay, at least you've learned from it. And I think that is always a difficult one in the development sector, where obviously we're using public funds most of the time. And it's really hard to sort of turn around and say to a donor, actually, no, I didn't reach my target. But I think do speak to your development partners before you go forward. As you do your proposals, do try and incorporate some space for experimentation and digitalization into your proposals, and take the development partner or the donor on that journey with you, so that they're also learning at the same time. And I think from our experience, we've seen that our development partners have been really happy to go on that journey with us and to learn as well, and they can then incorporate that in their experience. Thanks, Lukas.
Great. Thank you, Laura. That's really good to hear. Michael, maybe speaking about those partnerships, we heard from Laura about involving the evolving startups and partners you usually do not work with. We have a question in the chat around partners you usually work with, government and in particular, that might not be so familiar with digital approaches and innovation technology. How did you involve them into the strategy development? How did you make them part of the process and not just visitors or spectators?
Thanks a lot for this question. I would say retrospectively, we should have done it even more, actually. So what we did in the very beginning, since it was also the beginning of the project, we were in parallel constructing relationships and finding out who within those organizations were actually very keen to work with us, who were maybe also a bit more inclined to work on digital approaches and not, and who would also have the convening power to actually then afterwards explain to the Secretary General that this is a very good idea. So I would say that what we did is we followed roughly, as I said, this approach that Regine shared previously. So it was an iterative process. However, our starting point was that actually there were a lot of interviews and discussions between project staff and Viamo experts, first of all, to get a better understanding of our project logic and where digital approaches could fit in. And it was afterwards, so in a second iteration, that we approached specific personnel, so key persons we identified in our partner institutions that would have a key role later on also in the implementation, and who would be able to actually provide some perspective. One example was that there was one director at the National Med Service where we sat down together, Viamo, myself, and him, and had a really in-depth and long discussion on what his view on all this was and what the potential could be. And this was actually quite an enriching experience because it also provided us with different, let's say, angles on what the priorities of those partners were. This was, however, not the case for other ministries, and there it was rather in the, let's say, in the first phase of implementation where we had the chance to really dig into it, and through the piloting, through first real use cases, that we were able to actually convince them and bring them on board. So there's what we did. We started with one concrete example and worked through it with them, had a look at it afterwards. Did it work out? Did it not work out? What were the numbers? And have an evaluation session with them to actually have a look at the numbers of users, at the response rates, and all this. So basically using quantitative information and actual feedback in order also to convince the partners that this is worth investing in. But this is something which is very difficult if you start developing a strategy in the beginning. Sometimes you don't have these numbers, or they're very abstract. So for us, this actually came a bit later in the process, and this is why I would definitely want to underline this iterative nature that Regine already shared. It's not a one-off exercise, but it's also with the partners, particularly with the government sector. It took us, I would say, 1.5 years to get them fully on board, actually to go down this journey with us. And still, for some of them, they are not yet on board. But I would say the key partners, it was 1.5 years of, I don't know, keeping the contact, checking in, having this session, having another private conversation, sharing data, etc. This is more or less the approach we took back then.
Great, thank you a lot. We're coming to the end of the session, but I'd like to again invite everyone to the further discussion session that we're having in a short while. Emily, while we're wrapping up, maybe you can share our speakers' contact details in the chat so everyone can also reach out to them. We've checked it's okay, so please make use of that, everyone here. But I'd like to thank all three of you for your participation and your input, and maybe, you know, a bit of a challenge. We're already a bit over time, but maybe in one sentence, your closing remark, your closing sentence. Let's start with Laura. What would be your closing sentence on digital strategy?
I think it would have to be just go for it. Like, don't be afraid to fail. I think that's the main thing I can say.
Cheers, thank you. Regine, what is your closing sentence?
I like Laura's, and I think mine would be an add-on to that. Go for it and do everything from your user's perspective, and that guides everything else from there on.
Great. And Michael, yours?
Whenever you have the chance to cut corners, or you think that you should go faster and just do something without doing it properly, just don't, because then it will fail afterwards. Whenever we try to cut corners, it didn't work out. So let's say proper non-digital project implementation is still really important for digital approaches. And I would encourage you to do that. We didn't always, and it came back to us.
Cheers. Thanks a lot. And with that, thank you everyone for your participation, for joining us in this session today. Really appreciate your participation, your interest. And yeah, again, I'd like to invite everyone for our discussion later today. I'm just checking the time. It is in about an hour from now. So feel free to join us. The link should be in the agenda, and we'd be happy to learn from your experiences and engage in deeper discussions and conversations. Thanks a lot, and see you soon.